The wind carried a strange quiet over the wide fields, the kind of quiet that made a farmer stop what he was doing and listen, really listen, to the land. That morning, the sky was pale and stretched thin, as if it had not yet decided what kind of day it wanted to give. The earth smelled of dust and old roots, and every fence post seemed to lean in with its own worries. It was on that uneasy morning that the farmer walked toward the corral where the horses waited, each one shifting, snorting, and stamping as if they knew something important was about to happen. He had come to choose a new draft horse, one strong enough to pull the plow and steady enough to work beside him through good days and harsh ones. The farmer had lived most of his life on this land. He understood crops, storms, seasons, and soil. He knew what a healthy field felt like under his boots and what a troubled one felt like too. What he did not understand that morning was the strange feeling pressing on his chest, a mix of hope and warning that made him pause at the corral gate. He scanned the horses one by one. Some were tall and well-built, some old and slow, some spirited and restless. Yet his eyes kept returning to one horse standing a little apart from the rest. The horse was big, with a dark coat that caught the thin morning light and held it like a quiet fire. His shoulders were broad, his stance was firm, but there was something else in the way he stood still while the others jostled and tossed their heads. The farmer had heard about this horse, heard the way people spoke his name, low and unsure. They called him Risky. Some said the name came from his size, others claimed it was because he had been stubborn when he was young. A few whispered that he had never truly bonded with anyone. Stories traveled fast in farming country, especially when a horse seemed different from the rest. Risky watched the farmer with deep, steady eyes as if weighing him in return. There was no wildness in his look, no hint of danger, only a strong patience that made the air around him feel heavier. The farmer stepped closer, gripping the worn rope in his hand. He had come here wanting a dependable worker. What he had not expected was to feel drawn to the very horse everyone warned him about. But the land had taught him something over the years. It taught him that sometimes strength hides itself, waiting for someone willing to see it. He stopped in front of Risky, close enough to feel the heat of the horse's breath. The others around them shifted and snorted, but Risky stayed still. The farmer raised his hand and touched the horse's neck. A small moment passed, something like a silent agreement forming between them. The horse did not flinch. He did not step away. He only lowered his head with a slow calm that settled into the farmer's bones. People standing nearby frowned when they saw which horse he was choosing. Some shook their heads and whispered to each other. A man leaned on the fence and called out that there were safer choices, easier choices, horses with better records and quieter tempers, but the farmer did not look back. Something about this horse called to him in a way he could not explain. Risky had a strength that felt real, not just muscle and bone, but something deeper, something a man could trust when a hard season rolled in. By the time the sun had lifted higher, Risky was tied to the back of the wagon, ready to be taken to his new home. The horse climbed in without trouble, as if he had been waiting for this day. The road back to the farm was long and worn, passing fields that had grown thin over the years. The farmer had worked hard to keep his land alive, yet storms and droughts had left their marks. Bringing home a new draft horse felt like a small step toward rebuilding what had been slowly slipping from his hands. As the wagon creaked along the bumpy trail, Risky stood quietly, steady even through the roughest patches. The farmer found himself glancing back often, surprised by the sense of calm the horse brought with him. It felt as if a new chapter had begun, though he could not yet see where it would lead. When they reached the farm, Risky stepped off the wagon with a slow, careful stride, as if he already understood the land he would be working. The farmhouse stood simple and weathered, the barn doors open and waiting. Chickens flapped across the yard, and the old dog lifted his head from the porch, curious about the newcomer. The farmer led Risky toward the barn, wondering how long it would take before horse and farm grew used to each other. Inside the barn, light filtered through the wooden slats in soft, dusty beams. The farmer guided Risky into a clean stall and took a moment to settle him in. The horse sniffed the hay, inspected the trough, and then stood quietly as if claiming the space as his own. For the first time in a long while, the farmer felt a sense of promise stirring inside him. He had taken a chance, and something told him the chance would matter more than he knew. The days that followed moved in a steady rhythm. The farmer woke early, fed the animals, checked the fields, and spent long hours working with Risky. The horse proved strong, pulling the plow with an even power that never wavered. He did not tire quickly, did not resist commands, and did not show the stubborn streak the stories had warned about. Instead, he worked with a quiet loyalty that surprised even the farmer. Word spread quickly through the nearby town that the farmer had chosen the horse no one else wanted. Some folks said he had been foolish. Others waited for news of the first problem, sure that Risky would eventually show the behavior people feared. But the farmer kept his focus on the land and the work, paying little mind to outside voices. Risky had become his partner, and together they began to breathe new life into the struggling fields. Yet the quiet mornings and the steady work could not hide the growing tension around the farm. Strange signs began to appear in the distance. Tracks near the far fence lines that did not belong to cows or deer, broken branches in the orchard, a shadow moving late at night near the grain shed. The farmer kept noticing small things that felt out of place, small things that unsettled him more each day. Risky sensed it too. The horse grew more alert, more watchful, often stopping mid-step as if listening to something the farmer could not hear. He would lift his head toward the woods at the edge of the property, ears forward, muscles tight as if waiting for something to emerge. One night, after a long day in the fields, the farmer stepped outside to cool air and a moon hanging low behind drifting clouds. The silence felt different that night, heavier, as though the land held its breath. In the barn, Risky paced softly, restless in a way the farmer had not seen before. The horse kept turning his head toward the dark tree line beyond the pasture, nostrils flaring. The farmer stood still, sensing the tension crawling through the air. Something was out there, something close. The wind shifted, carrying a faint sound, a crack or a shuffle, too soft to name yet too sharp to ignore. Risky's hooves thudded once against the stall floor, a warning more than a reaction. The farmer stepped toward the barn door, heart tightening as the night around him grew darker. He reached for the latch, eyes fixed on the shadows moving near the far side of the property. Risky let out a low breath, not frightened but ready, as if preparing for something the farmer could not yet see. The sound came again, clearer this time, followed by a sudden movement near the fence. The farmer froze, unsure what waited in the dark and unsure what the next moment would bring. The line between safety and danger felt thin as a single thread, ready to snap without warning. And as he strained to see through the night, Risky stepped forward in his stall, muscles coiled, watching the same shadows with a fierce, unblinking focus that told the farmer one thing. Whatever was coming for the farm had finally arrived. The shift in the darkness felt heavier than any passing animal could cause. The farmer stood at the barn door, the cool night air brushing against his face as Risky stayed tense beside him. The shadows near the fence lingered in place as if they were waiting for the right moment to move. The farmer could feel the land holding its breath again, the same way it had on the morning he first chose the draft horse. It was the kind of moment that made a person aware of every small sound, every shift of wind through the grass, every heartbeat that pumped a little too fast. The farmer stepped toward the open yard, his boots sinking lightly into the soil. Risky watched every step he took, ears sharp, muscles drawn tight. There had always been stories about strange things happening in remote fields, mostly told by old neighbors at the feed store. Stories about unusual prints near barns, or faint voices carried by the wind, or livestock spooked for no reason. The farmer had never believed much in those tales. The land had always made sense to him, but tonight he wasn't sure what to believe. He stopped in the middle of the yard and looked toward the tree line. For a moment, nothing moved. Then, just as he was about to turn back, a cold gust swept across the property, bending the tall grass and making the old weather vane spin with a soft whine. Risky let out a short breath, unsettling in its intensity. Whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was only hiding. The farmer tightened his jaw and returned to the barn. He checked all the locks, made sure the lantern was full, and stood beside Risky, who kept shifting his weight with restless energy. It was clear the horse sensed more than the farmer could. He brushed a hand down Risky's neck, hoping to ease the tension, but Risky's focus stayed locked on the dark fields outside. The night dragged slowly after that. The farmer sat on a wooden crate near Risky's stall, listening to the distant sounds of the farm. He heard the old windmill creak, the barn roof settle, the hens rustle in their coop. Nothing else stirred. The shadows near the fence did not return, but something in the air refused to settle. It felt as though the whole land was waiting for something, and the farmer couldn't shake the thought that whatever had visited the edge of his property wasn't just passing through. Morning arrived with a thin layer of fog rolling across the fields. The sunlight fought its way through the thick white haze, turning everything into a soft blur. The farmer stepped out of the barn and scanned the area where he had seen the movement the night before. He found nothing at first glance, but when he walked closer, he noticed footprints in the dirt near the fence. Deep impressions. Not from a horse, not from cattle, not from anything he recognized. He crouched down, running his fingers lightly over the ground. The prints were wide, uneven, and spaced far apart. Something heavy had walked there. Something that did not belong anywhere near his farm. He swallowed hard and stood, staring at the woods that bordered his land. The trees stood silent, as if guarding whatever had passed through the night. Risky remained at the barn door, watching him closely. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, tracking every small noise in the distance. The farmer walked toward him, holding back the worry growing inside. He didn't want fear to take root in him. Fear made poor decisions. Fear made a man second-guess his own instincts. But whatever had left those tracks was not something he could ignore. He spent the rest of the morning checking the rest of the property. The orchard showed broken branches he hadn't noticed before. The grain shed door hung slightly off its hinge, not fully broken, but pushed hard enough to bend the metal latch. A few sacks inside had been torn open, the grain spilling across the floor. Nothing was taken, just torn, as if someone or something had been looking for something else and became frustrated. The farmer tried to make sense of it, but every answer he came up with felt incomplete. He kept thinking about the whispering stories old farmers used to share in hushed voices, yet none of those tales matched what he was seeing. And even if they did, he didn't want to rely on stories. He needed facts, something he could understand. He returned to the barn and saddled Risky with steady hands. If something was stalking the edge of his land, he needed to know. So he mounted the horse and urged him gently toward the far fence, where the tracks had been. Risky moved with quiet strength, his hooves thudding softly against the ground. Even with the saddle on, he stayed alert, head lifted, ears forward. They followed the edge of the property, the fog beginning to lift as the sun warmed the fields. Risky's breathing remained calm, but the farmer could feel the tension in the horse's muscles. They reached the place where the tracks had been and moved deeper into the trees. The air grew cooler under the canopy, the scent of damp leaves filling the space around them. The farmer held the reins tightly as Risky stepped over fallen branches and pushed through thick underbrush. The forest felt different that day, still but not peaceful. Quiet but not calm. It was the kind of quiet a person noticed, the kind that made you think you were being watched. The farmer didn't say a word, but he knew Risky felt it too. The horse's every step was cautious, controlled. They followed a faint trail through the woods until they reached a small clearing. The ground was disturbed. Not heavily, but enough to show something large had moved through recently. A few rocks were overturned. A patch of soil had been dug into, leaving a shallow hole. The farmer dismounted and knelt beside it. His fingertips brushed the dirt. It was fresh. He stood again, turning slowly, scanning the tree line around the clearing. Nothing moved. No sound came from the branches overhead, but the feeling of being watched hung in the air. Risky shifted slightly, his tail flicking once in warning. The farmer exhaled and decided they had learned enough for one morning. They returned to the farm, following the same path back through the trees. When they reached the open fields, he felt the tightness in his chest ease just a little. The farm, even with its troubles, still felt like home, still felt like a place he understood. But the tracks, the torn grain sacks, the broken orchard branches, and now the disturbed clearing, whatever had come near the farm had a purpose, and it wasn't simply wandering around. Something was searching for something. Or someone. Over the next few days, the farmer tried to keep life as normal as possible. He repaired the grain shed latch, cleaned the orchard, and checked the fences every morning. He worked the fields with Risky beside him, grateful for the horse's steady strength, yet the unease never left him. It sat like a weight in the back of his mind, even during the calmest hours. Risky grew even more watchful. He would stop suddenly in the middle of a task, ears turning toward the woods, nostrils flaring. At night he paced lightly in his stall, never fully relaxed. The farmer began leaving a lantern lit in the barn, feeling a strange need to keep the darkness at bay. Neighbors noticed him acting quieter than usual. At the supply store, someone asked if everything was all right on the farm. He nodded, gave a simple answer, and left quickly. He didn't want to spread worry or draw attention. The farm had always been something he handled on his own. But this time, the sense of something coming felt stronger each day. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the fields in deep gold, the farmer walked to the pasture where Risky grazed. The air smelled warm and earthy, and for a moment everything seemed peaceful. He leaned on the fence and watched the horse lift his head, grass falling from his mouth as he stared toward the woods again. The farmer followed Risky's gaze. At first he saw only trees, the same line of tall trunks and thick leaves he had looked at 1,000 times before, but then he noticed a shape. Not moving, just standing between two trees, too still to be a deer, too large to be a stray cow. His heartbeat quickened. He narrowed his eyes, trying to make out the figure. The shape shifted slightly, not stepping forward, not stepping back, just shifting like it was adjusting its weight. The farmer straightened. Risky's ears snapped forward, every muscle tight. The shape slowly faded back into the shadows, disappearing without a sound. The farmer felt the ground grow cold beneath him, even though the air remained warm. He wanted to tell himself it had been a trick of the light. A stump, a shadow, anything else, but Risky's reaction told him the truth. Something had been standing there, watching them. That night, the wind returned, sweeping across the fields with a sharper bite. The farmer locked every door and double-checked the barn. Risky stood alert, refusing to settle. The lantern flickered against the wooden walls, casting shifting shapes across the floor. The farmer sat beside the horse again, listening for the slightest sound from outside. The tension from the first night had returned, thicker now, heavier. Whatever had watched them from the trees was not finished. It was getting closer. More curious. More bold. The farmer glanced at the barn door, then back at Risky. The horse's breathing remained steady, but his eyes were fierce, focused on something far beyond the barn walls. Something in the distance snapped, a branch, a deliberate sound. Risky's head lifted sharply. And the farmer knew without question that whatever had come onto his land was no longer just wandering near the edges. It was approaching the farm again, this time with purpose. The night pressed against the barn walls like a slow, tightening grip. The farmer sat near Risky, listening closely, every muscle awake and alert. The sound in the distance had been sharp enough to cut through the wind, sharp enough to remind him that whatever lurked beyond the pasture had grown bold. The lantern light flickered in uneven patterns, spreading shadows along the rafters that swayed like unsettled thoughts. Risky kept his head angled toward the barn door, breathing steady but ready, as if he expected something to happen any minute. The farmer tried to steady his own breathing. Fear had never helped him handle anything on the farm. When drought had dried the fields or storms had ripped through the fences, he had learned to move with purpose, not panic. But this was different. Fences could be fixed. Fields could be replanted. What hid in the woods was something unknown, something that operated with intention. That thought sat heavy in his chest. Hours passed without another sound, but the tension stayed thick. When the first hint of daylight touched the barn window, the farmer finally stood, stretching the stiffness from his back. Risky nudged his shoulder softly, as if sensing the long night had worn him thin. He stroked the horse's neck and stepped outside, the cold morning air biting at his skin. The fields looked calm, too calm. The ground held dew that sparkled under the rising sun, and the trees at the edge of the property stood still. Nothing seemed disturbed, no new tracks. No broken branches. It should have given him relief, but instead it made his nerves itch. The silence felt staged, as if the land was hiding something beneath its calm surface. He walked the property anyway, checking every fence line, every gate, every small corner of the farm where something might be out of place. He found nothing unusual. Yet he could not shake the certainty that whatever had approached the night before was still close, watching, waiting. The farmer returned to the barn where Risky stood alert, his ears picking up even the softest noises. He seemed far more in tune with the land than any animal the farmer had ever known. The farmer saddled him and decided to ride the full perimeter again, hoping to understand what they were dealing with. Risky moved with strong, deliberate steps, scanning the landscape as they circled the fields. They reached the far corner near the orchard, where the broken branches had first appeared. The trees swayed gently, giving off a faint, sweet smell. The farmer slowed Risky to a stop and looked around. Then he noticed something he had missed before. The ground near the orchard fence was disturbed again, but not with footprints. This time it looked as though something had dragged across the soil, creating long, uneven marks leading back into the woods. The farmer dismounted and crouched to inspect the markings. They were fresh, the soil still soft and dark beneath the top layer. Whatever had done this had passed through only hours earlier. He ran a hand across the dirt, trying to understand the pattern. It wasn't an animal drag, nor did it look like anything a person would leave behind. It was irregular, powerful, and heavy. Risky snorted behind him, pacing in a tight circle with unease. The farmer stood and stepped back. He didn't want to push too far into the woods that morning. Something told him that whoever or whatever had been creeping around the orchard did not want to be tracked. Instead, he mounted Risky again and rode back to the farm, feeling the weight of the new evidence settle in his mind. That afternoon, the farmer decided he couldn't handle this alone. He hitched the wagon and traveled into town to speak with a neighbor he trusted. This neighbor had lived on his own stretch of land for decades and had dealt with his fair share of strange occurrences. The farmer thought if anyone could offer some clarity, it would be him. When he arrived, he found the neighbor stacking firewood near his barn. The neighbor greeted him with a warm nod but quickly noticed a strain on the farmer's face. They talked at length about the tracks, the strange shadows, and the tension that had settled across the farm. The neighbor listened without interrupting, his expression slowly tightening. When the farmer finished, the neighbor leaned closer, lowering his voice. He explained that over the past few months he had heard unusual noises near his property too, mostly late at night. Something moving in the dark, something big. He had brushed it off at first, thinking it was a wandering animal, but then his livestock had started acting strange, spooked, restless, fidgeting at odd hours. He hadn't seen tracks like the ones the farmer described, but he admitted he had been keeping a lantern lit more often than usual. He felt the same prickling sense of being watched whenever he walked near the woods behind his barn. That was when he suggested something the farmer had not considered. Whatever was roaming through their land wasn't just moving randomly. It had a pattern, a path, a purpose. The farmer thanked him for the conversation, though it did little to ease his mind, and returned home before sunset. Risky waited at the fence when he arrived, as if he knew the farmer needed him close. The sky was painted in streaks of gold and orange, but beneath the beauty, the farmer felt the same pull of dread. The farm, once a place of calm routine, now felt like a stage where something hidden was preparing to reveal itself. Days passed with the tension growing. Chickens refused to leave their co-op some mornings. The old dog barked at the woods with a low, uneasy growl. Risky became even more protective of the farmer, staying close and reacting sharply to any sound from the trees. The farmer worked the fields as usual, but every turn of the plow, every swing of the tool felt overshadowed by the sense of something looming. He considered setting traps. He considered posting lanterns around the perimeter at night. He even thought about calling in more help from town. But each idea carried risk, and none of them felt right. He didn't want to frighten the farm animals more than they already were, and he didn't want to provoke whatever was out there. Instead, he turned to observation. He kept track of the sounds he heard each night, the areas where Risky showed the most alertness, and the places where small disturbances appeared on the land. Slowly, he began to see a faint pattern. Whatever was moving around the property seemed to circle it rather than approach directly. It stayed along the edges, watching from a distance, testing boundaries. Some nights, the tension felt lighter. Other nights, it felt so heavy the farmer could hardly sleep. He found himself keeping the lantern burning longer, sitting near the barn door with Risky beside him, scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. He thought he saw something a few times, but each time the shape vanished before he could make out any clear details. One evening, the sky grew darker earlier than usual. Thick clouds rolled over the hills, swallowing the last of the sunlight. Risky grew restless before the first drop of rain even touched the ground, shifting constantly, as if the storm carried something more than wind and water. The farmer tightened the barn doors and checked the animals, but even inside, the storm felt too close. Thunder cracked in the distance, and the wind howled against the barn walls. Rain poured onto the fields in heavy sheets. The farmer stayed inside with Risky, listening to the storm rage. But beneath the sound of thunder and rain, he heard something else. A low, dragging noise. A steady scrape against the earth. Risky's entire body tensed, ears turning sharply toward the direction of the sound. The farmer moved closer to the window and peered out, though he could see only the blurred shapes of the storm. The dragging sound came again, louder this time, closer. The wind carried it across the yard, making it impossible to ignore. The farmer's pulse hammered in his chest. Whatever was outside was not deterred by the storm. In fact, it seemed to move with purpose through the pounding rain. Risky let out a soft warning, not loud but deep, a sound the farmer had never heard from him before. He stepped toward the barn door, placing a hand on the latch. The storm made the wood rattle in its frame, and the cold air seeped through the cracks. He listened again, waiting for the noise, waiting for some clue of what might be outside. The dragging sound came once more, then stopped completely. Silence fell, broken only by the storm. The farmer stood frozen, unsure whether to open the door or stay where he was. Risky moved beside him, positioning himself between the farmer and the door, as if prepared for whatever waited outside. Then a loud thud hit the side of the barn. The walls shook for a brief moment. Risky reared slightly, stomping the ground. And the farmer knew this was no longer the same distant presence that had circled the land for days. It had come right to the edge of the barn, bold and unhidden. The rain hammered the roof, thunder rolled across the hills, and another thud struck the barn wall even harder than the first. Risky's eyes burned with fierce focus, ready to defend. The farmer felt the weight of the moment settle over him as another heavy blow landed on the outside wall, closer to the door this time. Whatever had been watching the farm was now standing in the storm, trying to break its way inside. The barn shuddered again under the force of the blow, this time strong enough to make dust fall from the rafters. The farmer stepped back, instinct pulling him away from the door even as some part of him wanted to see what was on the other side. Rain hammered the roof in heavy waves, thunder rolled across the land, and the wind tore through the yard like it carried warnings within it. Risky stood tall and rigid, head high, nostrils flaring, his hooves shifting with controlled fury. He looked ready to charge through the door if the farmer allowed it. Another strike hit the wall. This one landed lower, closer to the ground, rattling the wooden beams in a deep vibration the farmer felt in his spine. Something dragged along the outside after the strike, a slow scrape that moved from one corner of the barn toward the door. The sound grew louder, heavier, as though something enormous was pushing itself through the mud. Risky stomped again, his breath sharp. The farmer knew he could not open the door. He knew that much without question. Whatever was outside was far bigger than a stray animal, far stronger than a wandering traveler. It moved with intention, and every sign pointed to the same truth. The farm was being tested. The boundary between safety and danger had never felt so thin. The next blow came suddenly, this time right beside the door. The wood bowed inward, not breaking, but bending enough to show the force behind it. Risky let out a fierce sound, deeper than any noise the farmer had heard from him. It wasn't fear. It was a warning. The farmer grabbed the nearest pitchfork, not because he thought it would be enough to defend against whatever was out there, but because he needed something in his hands. Something to ground himself. something to prove he wasn't helpless. He eased closer to the door, just enough to place his back against it. The wood felt cold, trembling lightly with each gust of wind. He didn't dare peek through the cracks. He didn't dare speak. He only listened. The creature outside moved again, scraping its weight along the ground. Then, slowly, the sound shifted. It wasn't dragging now. It was circling the barn. The farmer followed its movement with his ears, each step heavy and uneven. Risky's head tracked the movements too, turning with perfect precision. The creature circled once, then twice. On the third slow pass, it stopped near the back wall. The barn grew quiet for a few long seconds. The storm still raged, but the sound of the creature had vanished. The farmer strained to hear anything beyond the storm, his breath tight. Then the creature's claws dug into the wood. The back wall groaned under the pressure, bending inward as if something was testing how easily it could be torn open. Risky spun around, planting himself between the farmer and the weakening wall. Another push came. The boards creaked loudly. The farmer's heart pounded against his ribs. He knew the creature was trying to find a weak point. It was learning the structure, testing its options. This wasn't mindless force. It was deliberate. A sudden flash of lightning lit up the barn interior through the slats. For a fraction of a second, the farmer saw the outline of something massive pressed against the outside boards. A broad shape, wild, too large to compare to anything he knew. The thunder crashed a moment later, shaking the ground. The creature retreated again, circling. The storm gave it cover, masking its steps. The farmer steadied himself and placed a hand on Risky's shoulder. The horse turned his head slightly, acknowledging the touch. Despite the danger, Risky looked unshaken, determined, ready. Minutes crawled by. The creature did not strike again. The storm began to ease, rain slowing to a softer rhythm. The wind settled into a steady hiss. The farmer waited, unwilling to move until he knew for certain that the danger had passed. But deep inside he sensed this wasn't the end of it. Whatever had attacked the barn wasn't retreating. It was watching, waiting for the right moment. When daylight finally broke, the farmer stepped outside cautiously. The ground was churned and muddy, deep grooves carved near the barn walls. The back corner where the creature had tested the wood was dented inward, the boards cracked slightly. It had been close to breaking through. Risky followed him out, head raised, scanning every angle. The morning air felt uneasy, like a calm forced over chaos. The farmer checked the rest of the property, finding new tracks near the pasture. Deep impressions, spread wide, not human, not animal. He didn't know what troubled him more, the size or the intent. Risky walked beside him as he moved from area to area. Their bond had tightened through the fear of the night. The farmer felt it with every step. This horse wasn't just aware of the danger. He was preparing for it. By afternoon, the farmer knew he needed a plan. He couldn't wait for the next attack. He walked the property again, marking the places where the creature liked to hide, tracking the pattern of its movements based on the disturbed soil. It always came from the same stretch of woods, always circled in the same wide arc, and always returned to that same path. The farmer's mind worked through every possibility. Reinforce the barn, move the animals farther from the woods, build a stronger fence, but none of that felt like enough. The creature wasn't limited by wood or fences. It pushed through both easily. It wanted something, and until the farmer knew what, he would always be vulnerable. That evening he saddled Risky again, even though the sky looked heavy with clouds. He needed to follow the path the creature used. Not to confront it, but to understand its reason for coming. Risky seemed to sense the importance of the ride. His movements were steady, controlled, confident. They crossed the pasture, rode along the fence, and entered the woods where the tracks disappeared. Inside the woods, the air felt colder. The trees grew so thick the sky barely showed through. Risky slowed his steps, attentive to every crack and shift of the forest floor. The farmer kept his hand near the reins, ready for anything. They followed the tracks deeper until they reached a clearing. The same clearing where he had found the disturbed soil days earlier. Only this time the markings were different. The hole was deeper, wider. Something had been digging with purpose. Near the hole lay pieces of something the farmer couldn't identify at first. Bits of old rope, splintered wood. Rusted metal? It looked like remnants of a wagon or crate long forgotten. The farmer crouched and brushed away the dirt. His fingers found old markings burned into the wood. Not letters he recognized. Symbols. Risky let out a low sound, stepping back as if the sight unsettled him. The farmer felt the unease in his own chest. Why would a creature dig up something buried so long ago? And what was it searching for under the soil? Before he could search further, Risky's ears snapped forward. The farmer froze. A sound drifted through the trees, slow, heavy, measured, not far. The farmer mounted quickly, urging Risky back the way they came. The horse moved without hesitation, weaving through the trees with swift, powerful steps. The sound behind them grew louder. Branches cracked under the weight of something massive. The farmer didn't dare look back. He trusted Risky's speed, letting the horse lead them out of the woods. They burst into the open fields just as the last light of day faded behind thick clouds. Risky didn't slow until they reached the barn. Only then did the farmer dare glance back. The woods stood silent, still, but he knew better. The creature was there, hidden among the trees, watching. Later that night he studied the strange symbols he had found etched on the old wood. They meant something. Something connected to the creature, something tied to the land. The farm he had lived on for years held secrets he never imagined. And whatever had been awakened in those woods was growing more restless, more determined. As the wind picked up again and the barn settled into the darkness, the farmer sat beside Risky once more. The horse stood calmly, but his eyes remained focused on the shadowed corners of the farm. The farmer knew the next encounter would not be like the last. The creature had tested the barn, tested the land. Tested their fear. The next time it would not test, it would act. And they had to be ready. The smoke drifted upward in thin lines as the flames settled into quiet orange shapes. The barn was still standing, though half the walls looked bruised from the long night. The air carried the sharp bite of burnt wood mixed with a sweetness that only came once trouble had passed. The farmer stood beside Risky with one hand on the horse's neck, trying to steady his breathing. Risky stayed close, nudging his shoulder lightly, as if checking that everything was all right. The ground was covered in wet soil, dark from the water the neighbors had thrown to stop the fire. The farmer stared at the place where the roof had nearly caved in, thankful that Risky had sensed the danger earlier and dragged him awake before the flames reached the stalls. For a moment he closed his eyes, letting the relief settle in, but he knew the night had not ended without raising new questions. The guards from the nearby town wandered around the farmyard, trying to understand what caused the fire. Some of them believed it came from an accident, maybe a loose lantern or a misplaced ember. But the farmer knew he had checked every lamp before sleeping. Risky also seemed restless, turning his head toward the distant fence line more than once. The horse kept stamping his hoof as if he sensed something left unfinished. The farmer placed a gentle hand on the reins to calm him. He told the guards he would look into things himself once the sun rose fully. They left with a promise to return later, though their puzzled faces showed they had no real answers. When the farmer finally walked Risky back toward the stable, the horse refused to cross the doorway. He stood firm, refusing to enter the place that had almost taken the farm. The farmer understood. Risky would need time before stepping into that stall again. Instead of forcing him, he tied a clean sheet of canvas between two beams outside, so Risky would have shelter until the barn repairs could be made. As dawn stretched across the fields, the farmer felt the weight of everything settle on his shoulders. He had nearly lost the farm, the animals, and the fields that meant everything to him. But Risky had saved them all, and that truth kept him from sinking into worry. Neighbors drifted in through the morning, offering help to fix the damage. They brought tools, rope, spare boards, and even hot bread to keep the workers going. They praised Risky and told stories of how draft horses could sense trouble before people could. Some had heard of horses that refused to rest when storms approached or pulled their owners away from danger at night. Risky stood calmly among the voices, accepting pats from children who had never dared come so close before. Even those who once joked about the farmer choosing the horse with the strange eyes now spoke with softer tones. The farmer worked beside them, grateful for their hands and their kindness. As the sun climbed higher, the farmer found a loose plank near the side of the barn with markings that didn't belong there. Someone had moved it, maybe recently. He checked the area and found faint footprints pressed into the soil behind the beams, footprints too deliberate to be dismissed. He didn't mention this to the neighbors. He didn't want worry spreading across homes that already lived with enough of it. But he kept the discovery close, and when he walked away, Risky stepped in line beside him, following without being asked. The farmer looked at the horse and felt a new understanding pass between them. Later that afternoon, as the repairs continued, the farmer saddled Risky and rode into the backfields. He needed to see if anything else had been disturbed. The fence post looked normal, and the crops seemed untouched, but the quiet in the far corner of the property felt too heavy. Risky slowed and lifted his head, sniffing the breeze. The farmer followed Risky's gaze and spotted movement behind a cluster of trees. It disappeared quickly, leaving only a rustle behind. The farmer kept still, waiting, listening. Risky's muscles tightened, ready for anything. But nothing else moved. He turned Risky back toward the house, trying to shake off the unease. Whatever had stirred in the trees did not show itself again during the ride, but the farmer could not ignore the way Risky kept glancing back. When they reached the yard, the neighbors were packing up, promising to return the next day to help finish the barn. The farmer thanked them and watched the last wagon disappear down the dusty road. The farm grew quiet, more quiet than it had been in days. That night he didn't sleep in the house. He set up a chair outside beside Risky's shelter so he could keep watch. The moonlight spread across the field in pale streaks, revealing every shift of grass and every flutter of the leaves. Risky dozed on and off, but each time the farmer stirred, the horse lifted his head immediately. They kept their silent watch until the moon slid behind clouds, then Risky tensed. The farmer followed his gaze again. At the far edge of the property, a lantern glowed faintly between the trees. Someone was out there? The farmer reached for the old rifle he kept for wild animals but didn't lift it. He didn't want trouble to turn into something worse. Instead he stood still, letting his breathing slow until he could hear the rustle of footsteps approaching. Risky stayed beside him. The lantern light moved closer, then stopped. A voice called out faintly, asking if anyone was awake. The farmer tightened his grip on the rifle but answered. A stranger stepped into the clearing, holding the lantern high. His clothes looked worn and dusty, like he had traveled far. He said he meant no harm and had seen the smoke from the fire earlier in the night. He claimed he came to offer help, but something in his tone made the farmer uneasy. Before the farmer could ask any questions, Risky snorted loudly and stepped between him and the stranger. The horse's ears pinned back and his body stiffened. The stranger froze, raising both hands. He insisted again that he came only to check on the farm, but Risky refused to move, blocking the path with a firm stance. The farmer watched the stranger carefully, wondering why Risky reacted so sharply. There was no threat in the man's posture, yet the horse sensed something else. The stranger shifted his feet, uneasy under the horse's glare. The farmer told the man he appreciated the concern but didn't need any visitors at this hour. The stranger nodded slowly and stepped back. But as the lantern light swung, it caught a mark on the man's sleeve, a smudge that matched the ash from the burnt barn walls. The farmer's heart tightened. He didn't say anything, waiting to see what the man would do. The stranger kept retreating until the trees swallowed him again, leaving only the faint glow of the lantern moving deeper into the dark. Risky didn't relax for a long time. He kept staring at the place where the stranger disappeared, tail flicking in steady warning. The farmer understood this was not over. He stayed awake until the sky shifted toward morning. He knew now that something deliberate had caused the fire. Someone had planned it. Someone had been watching the farm long before the flames started, and that someone had returned. When the sun began to rise, spreading soft light over the fields, the farmer felt a mix of fear and determination. He looked at Risky, who stood tall and alert beside him. Whatever was coming, they would face it together. The stranger's return meant danger was closer than ever, and the next move could change the future of the farm completely. The day began with a tense silence that felt like the air was holding its breath. And as the farmer prepared for what might come next, Risky took his place at his side, ready for whatever trouble approached from the shadows of the trees.